Hello, students, and welcome as we begin our exploration into chapter number 7 on the Industrial Revolution. I cannot emphasize enough how significant the Industrial Rev really is as a turning point for humanity and for world history. You'll feel as though in the course that we're really entering a new phase of the class simply because with the introduction of this new transportation, new technology, the world as it was previously known prior to this is fundamentally changed. The workforce has changed. The way people live their lives has changed. The production of food and clothing has changed. So you can kind of think of this as like moving into the next half of our class together as we start to see really society is revolutionized. Please title your notes for today, Into the Machine. So, just to begin, in terms of industrialization and really what it is, in the early 1700s, we had the development of machines and new forms of labor. And this really becomes the, precipice or beginning of the Industrial Revolution. At first, we're seeing small things like crop rotation, these revolutionary ideas where basically you'd be planting crops that are different from each other each year to keep the soil fresh, changing past practices to better the lives of citizens and better the lives of people, and ultimately produce crops more quickly. And this starts to spiral into other forms of life as well. So just to show you, this is a world map around 1754, prior to the French and American revolutions, but really where we're going to start to see this industrialization taking place. So these are the world empires at the time. So you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, this is an example of a water wheel, and industrialization is really going to begin in Great Britain. And the reason why it's really isolated to this region of the world is because Great Britain is an island and it's better able to actually contain its advancements without it getting out to the rest of the world powers. Because Great Britain had a great deal of access to water as an island, businessmen took advantage of this and they began taking out loans to finance these factories and invest in machinery, which really becomes the beginning of industrialization. The first industry that's really targeted is textiles, which mostly involves like fabrics and clothing, obviously a commodity that people desperately needed. Prior to this, clothes were completely made in the home, usually by women. So usually like the young girls, mothers, grandmothers would gather around. They would be knitting and putting clothing together for their family, and everything that you wore was produced at your house. Now, with these new revolutionary technologies, you could actually purchase the clothing, from a salesperson. And the spinning jenny is the first example of a revolutionized loom. And a spinning jenny looks something like this. You can see how the spools are all laid out on the foreground, and then the wheel spins and it pulls the thread through and ultimately creates your fabric pieces. So in terms of factories, the use of the water frame completely changes how quickly machinery can run. And because we needed raw materials to create these fabrics, we end up with a desperate need for cotton, which is going to come in the form of the cotton gin, which you'll see is created by Eli Whitney. But cotton is in abundance in the American South, right, where we're seeing slavery become much more significant. So interestingly, slavery was actually declining following the American Revolution because all these new ideas about liberty and freedom were circulating in the colonies, now in the States. And it was very likely that slavery could have been abolished much earlier. In many parts of the world, we see slavery end much more quickly. But then with the invention of the cotton gin, the Southern economy explodes, largely dependent on cotton. How is cotton picked? Traditionally by slave labor. So in effect, the creation of the cotton gin is one of the biggest booms for slavery in the world. And in United States history, one next year, the cotton gin is actually a significant item on the road to the Civil War, really creating two different economies in the United States, one dependent on cotton, on slave labor, and one more dependent on factories and industrialization in the North. So this is basically how a cotton gin functions. You can see that you put the raw cotton in on one side, you spin it, and then it actually pulls all of the seeds out and then deposits the seeds in the bottom of the cylinder. And then the clean cotton moves through the other side. So you can produce fresh cotton very, very quickly. Prior to this, slaves would have had to pick it out by hand, just a much more difficult process. This is what a textile mill or a textile factory would look like. You can see how the wheel or the water wheel on the bottom basically moves these pulleys, and these pulleys move the actual presses, and these presses are used to ultimately make the fabric as the spools spin. In terms of transportation, we also see our first steam engine created by James Watt. And with these new steam engines, we end up with steamboats and locomotives. And they just completely change how people live their lives. Prior to this, you very likely would have never left your own town or where you were born. But now with these new forms of transportation, it's a lot easier to get around, and it's also a lot easier to sell your product or your commodity. If you're an entrepreneur or you're a business person, now you can actually sell your merchandise to people living much farther away, so you can earn a much greater profit. Just to show you, this is kind of like a hysterical depiction, but this is one of the first trains in Liverpool and a Manchester railway. This is 1830. Interestingly, these trains did not go very fast at all. They actually went very slow, but for the people riding in them, it felt like they were really booking it because the human body had never traveled, 30 miles per hour. So it felt like they were, flying. You can see here, this is the United States, and just look in a 50-year span, we end up with an isolated country, these uncharted territories, right, where, basically of all this land that no one's really explored. But with the introduction of these railway lines, all of the states are connected, and we end up with all of these territories becoming U.S. states as people use these railway lines to travel into them. So obviously there are some positives that come from industrialization. We end up with the world that we have today. It completely transforms life in Great Britain. Many people gain jobs where they're making more money. However, there is a dark side of this as well. You may be making more money than you were making before, but the conditions were horrifying, unhealthy, pollution, horrifying child labor. Life working in one of these factories would have been just something beyond what you could even comprehend, working from dusk till dawn, exhausted, falling asleep in the equipment, people being killed, losing limbs as you're working in these loud, noisy factories. Because of the bad conditions in factories and how business owners take advantage of their workers, a lot of tension begins to arise, and this really creates our first labor unions. So we also see this process of urbanization as well. So you may be thinking, well, why does anyone want to work in these factories if the conditions are so bad? And the answer is pay. You'd be making a lot more money working in the factories, so it's very enticing. So we end up with people moving to cities in these ridiculously large numbers, particularly to work in these factory settings. And the city populations blow up, they skyrocket. So now the question becomes, you have all these people moving into the cities very, very quickly. What's the issue? Where do they live? We didn't build apartments to accommodate this massive influx of people. So we end up with these very cheap rows of apartments, which you can see depicted over there to the right, probably the size of a walk-in closet or a very small cupboard where a whole family would live. They were extremely, extremely tiny, and they were extremely unsafe because of how quickly they were put together. This is actually a nice depiction of what tenements would have looked like in London, England. And again, each of these windows would be their own apartment, probably about 3 apartments per stack, and then you'd have a little courtyard where all the families could come outside. Again, in terms of the conditions, there is no sanitation or building codes whatsoever. Houses were built very quickly. So they were extremely unstable. The streets were filled with sewage, no plumbing system at this point, so there was human feces and waste in the streets. No sewage drains either, so the city smelled so awful that honestly, it took the members of parliament not being able to deal with the smell to actually pass legislation to accommodate or better, deal with these issues. Piles and piles of garbage in the streets. Like imagine your garbage men where people never came ever. and what the streets would look like in your town, that's what it looks like in London and a lot of these big cities. Before labor laws, bosses could basically force their workers to do whatever they wanted. 14-hour workdays, 6 days a week other than Sunday. People were exhausted. Factories were also extremely dangerous. As I said, like, you could be extremely injured in the equipment, you could lose a limb. And mines were even more dangerous. They could very easily collapse. Boilers could explode. Belts could break off and decapitate someone, or chop someone's limbs off. All sorts of horrifying stories. And of course, there is no workman's comp or insurance to protect you. If you're injured on the job, they simply find someone else to replace you. Here is an image of children playing outside during this period of industrialization. You can see playing next to a dead horse, also with their feet in a sewage drain on the side of the street. No understanding really of germs or the extent to which they could affect someone. So we end up with a lot of sick children, a lot of sick people, not understanding why they're becoming ill. Now we know it's because of these poor living conditions and health concerns. This is an example of a child mining. So this would be someone who is considered a drawer. So basically, they would climb through these narrow channels down to the mine below, and then they would pull out the materials, and they would basically pull them up by crawling. In many cases, these mines collapsed and people were smothered to death. So if you're extremely claustrophobic, this would definitely not have been the job for you. Just to show you a primary source about what these conditions looked like, this is from Mary Barton. She's someone who experienced the Industrial Rev in 1848. You went down one step even from the foul area into the cellar in which a family of human beings lived. It was very dark inside. The window panes, many of them were broken and stuffed with rags. The smell was so foul as almost to knock two men down. They began to penetrate the thick darkness of that place, and to see 3 or 4 little children rolling up on the damp, nay, wet brick floor through which the stagnant, filthy moisture of the streets oozed up. Just really showcasing how, horrifying of living conditions people were, going through. So we also had other threats as well, because we didn't have these, well-built cities or these, safeguards. We also have massive fires and very dangerous conditions as well. Limited water supply, no fire hydrants, no fire hoses. So if there was a fire, it could literally burn down an entire town. So a candle, which would have been used for lighting at the time, could just cause a massive, massive fire. And we saw things like that happen in the example of the Great Chicago Fire. According to legend, a cow knocked over a lantern and started the fire. That is very unlikely to be the case. But basically, all of Chicago was burnt down in a matter of hours, as you can see depicted here, as people are fleeing the city as it literally is engulfed in flames. So you may be wondering, how do we get from Great Britain to the United States? Great Britain forbid any engineers or mechanics from leaving the country with plans for their factories, but one mill worker, Sam Slater, memorized the plans for spinning machines, went to the United States, sold them to a developer named Moses Brown, and basically that becomes the beginning of American factories and American industrialization. So this is a good tie-in for U.S. history. So we end up with this really interesting time period called the Gilded Age. And the idea of something being gilded means that it looks great on the surface, but if you just peel it back a little bit, you realize that things are not quite what they appear. Like a gilded ring would be gold, but it's not really gold. If you just scratch the surface, you'd see the real, material on the bottom. So this is a term that was coined by Mark Twain, famous American author, real name Samuel Clemens. And he basically is describing this period of corruption in the United States, which is completely overshadowed by the wealth of a very few who he nicknames the robber barons. Basically, people who are barons because they are wealthy and they make themselves out to be royalty, but in reality, they're robbing their riches from the poor, from immigrants, from laborers, from farmers. And, while some were living in profound wealth due to industrialization, some were struggling quite a bit. And this is really highlighted in their homes. So many of these are located in Newport, Rhode Island. So just take a look at some of these massive houses. So this transitions us to a call for reforms. So you'll learn about this in United States History 1, but we had a photojournalist named Jacob Riis who begins really investigating the lives of people who were experiencing profound poverty during this era. So he's doing this in about 1890. Keep in mind the Industrial Rev is going on for decades and decades, basically hundreds of years. But in 1890, he's basically traveling through the streets of New York City and taking pictures of the slums and the conditions that workers are actually living in. And he puts them in a photo journal called How the Other Half Lives. In US History 2, your first chapter really deals with the progressive era, and you'll begin with journalists like him, muckrakers, who investigate these poor conditions and expose them. And his photos were really targeted at the wealthy and middle class and government officials to really show them, yeah, like industrialization is important, and it's important to have these factories and they're important for the American economy. But look at the conditions that people are living in as a result of them. Children with no shoes, huddled together by exhaust just for warmth. Dozens of immigrant men forced to sleep together in beds in very small tenements simply because they cannot afford a better place to live. Women basically living in basements, taking care of children in very poor conditions. Children working in factories with no shoes on, horrible safety measures that are extremely dangerous. People sleeping in like sewers and like basements and horrible conditions that will very much, make them very likely to become ill. People living in tenements that can clearly not hold an entire family. So going forward, we're going to transition in our next lesson into really who are these businessmen, who are these entrepreneurs, how do they make their fortunes, and how do these new capitalistic societies really begin to function as a result of all of this new industry. Then after that, we'll talk about these new economic philosophies that begin to challenge capitalism, namely communism and socialism, that start to push for these reforms to make the conditions of the workers or the proletariat better.